Ladies and gentlemen, Miranda, thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure to be here in the presence of a descendant of Cecil himself, in the church in which you'd almost certainly have worshipped, in a town which had ancestral connections to him, in front of his tomb, which is, I think, the most impressive teaching aid I've ever actually had. And I hope most of you actually went and had a look at it and saw the quite extraordinary object that it is. This huge confection of English alabaster with columns of precious imported marbles, gilt to the nth degree. The Tudors, dare one say, had a rather Arab taste. You know, everything is plastered in gold. There's a most wonderful remark of Francis I to the ambassador of his contemporary, Henry VIII, to a man rejoiced in the name of Sir John Wallop. And they were touring the gallery at Fontainebleau, which you may remember has got this most wonderful wooden coffered ceiling in precious woods. And it's what kings could do in those days. Sounds a bit like Boris Johnson. The English ambassador, Wallop, was given a leg up onto a bench so that he could actually feel things and discover what they were made of. And as he did so, Francis I commented to him, "Well, I like my ceilings in plain wood. Your king covers everything in gold, doesn't he?" So we see this very definitely with the tomb of William. Look at it. It's an exercise in extravagant, Italianate, classical architecture. It's a pair of mini triumphal arches. But what is lying beneath? What is lying beneath is William Cecil. I was asked at the 2 glasses of Prosecco ago, and I still remember it, at the beginning of the evening, I was asked, is this lifelike? Is it his actual dimensions? The answer is, it's a rough resemblance to him. I've no idea what his actual height was, but the thing that you can say with absolute certainty is that he is dressed on the tomb in a fashion which he never, ever wore in life. He is shown in magnificent gilded Greenwich armour. He is wearing the garter on his left leg. He's got a mantle, which is an uneasy compromise between the mantle of the Order of the Garter, the premier order of English chivalry, and the parliamentary robes of a noble. It's got on on his left shoulder, it's got the badge of the Order of the Garter. He's carrying in his hand the wand, which is the symbol of his principal office of Lord Treasurer. His feet are resting upon an heraldic lion. This is the man who took place in part in only a single military engagement as a young man and studiously avoided any contact with anything so violent thereafter, who actually pulled out a Bible when he was confronted with his great rival in power, when he was confronted with the man that we know as Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who was clamouring for armed intervention in France, and he pointed at those verses in the New Testament that quote Christ's words, "Those who live by the sword shall die by the sword." But here he is in armour as a knight, whereas in real life, and wearing red, scarlet and gold. In real life, he wore black. And there's a very famous portrait of him riding, not as a knight, but side saddle, sitting on what I think is a mule. In other words, who rode side saddle on a mule? Well, women, but above all, clergy. Cardinal Wolsey, when he rides in his pomp and circumstance, although very definitely he's dressed in scarlet, he is still riding on a mule as a token of humility. Because of Christ. So here we have this man with a violent contrast with the image of arrogant nobility in death and a very, very uneasy relationship to it in life. A tomb which sings of Italy and the classical, but at the same time shows a quasi-medieval knight. Cecil stands at a conjunction of cultures and values, at a clash of them. We are in the middle of another one. We're at manifestly end of the values that Cecil represents. That's what woke is about. That is what Black Lives Matter, that's what happened last year, to me is about. It is the deliberate destruction of that culture that Cecil stood for. It's another moment of a transformation of values. What I want to do is explore with you this evening some of the points at which Cecil stands, why there is this doubleness, what it represents in terms of the history of England, because it is an absolutely crucial moment. I've argued and argued repeatedly, if we want to understand ourselves, obviously we need to understand history, but the particular reason for studying the 16th century is that it is the prefiguration of our own. Remember, in the simplest way, Henry VIII's break with Rome simply is the first Brexit. The issues are absolutely identical, and the clash of values is identical. So to give us a sense of more about what this man thought he was and what his descendants thought he was, we've been, again, using the tomb of the visual aid. Let me read to you the actual inscription, the translation of the inscription which appears on the tomb. Sacred to God, the most good and great, and to memory. Cecil would love the fact that 500 years on, this man of no family whatever is being remembered as the author of two great noble dynasties. The most honourable, he's not modest, and far-renowned Lord William Cecil, Baron of Burghley, Lord High Treasurer of England, President of the Court of Wards, Knight of the most noble Order of the Garter, Privy Councillor to the most serene Elizabeth, Queen of England, etc., and Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, remember that. Under this tomb awaits the second coming of Christ. He is a passionate radical Protestant, who, for the excellent endowments of his mind, he is a boy of parts, as they would say in Scotland, who, for the excellent endowments of his mind, was first made Privy Councillor to Edward VI, King of England, afterwards to Queen Elizabeth, under whom, being entrusted with the greatest and most weighty affairs of this kingdom, and above all others approved in promoting the true religion and providing for the safety and honour of the Commonwealth, religion, Commonwealth, by his prudence, honesty. Well, I don't quite know how you acquire quite as much as he did with rigorous honesty, but let's leave that aside. Integrity and great services to the nation. He obtained the highest honours, and when he had lived long enough to nature, long enough to glory, but not long enough to his country, quietly fell asleep in Christ. That's him. Now, what's all this about? Who is this man by origin? Why is he here? The answer is that he is from a very marginal Welsh family that are honoured with the title of gentry, but a gentleman of Wales comes very far down the pecking order of early Tudor England, who was a servant of the key figure in the history of the Cecils, which is Lady Margaret Beaufort, the founder of the House of Tudor. And the reason that Stamford is on the map, the reason Burghley is here, is that very near to here you have what was now almost entirely disappeared. You have Lady Margaret Beaufort's great palace of Collyweston. And this was the centre of her honour. Margaret Beaufort is a truly astonishing figure, unlike her granddaughter Elizabeth, who is constantly talked of as a feminist icon. You can actually make a genuine claim for Margaret Beaufort as a feminist icon. She is the only woman before the late 19th century actually to be a Justice of the Peace. She is the only woman to preside over a court and administer high justice. She acquires deliberately, although she's very firmly married to her third husband, the Earl of Derby, she acquires the status of widow. Because, of course, the only way that a woman, before the Marriage Reform Acts of the 19th century, could exercise public office was as either as being single or a widow. If you were married, you were what was known as a covered woman, femme couverte, and it was your husband who acted on your behalf. She, even though her husband is very firmly alive, she acquires the status of a widow, and of course with it, the status of an uncrowned queen mother, my lady the king's mother. And it's through the service of this extraordinary woman that the Cecils rise. And then the son, that's Cecil's father, transfers himself to the inner household of Henry VIII. So this is a courtier family. It's on the inside of the Tudor world. And this, of course, takes us to what were the values of Cecil's grandfather? What were the values of Cecil's father? What were the values of medieval England? Because remember, the Tudors are the residuary legatees of the entire peerage of medieval England. What you get in the 15th century is a kind of, it's a scene out of a Jacobean tragedy, a fight to the death amongst the medieval aristocracy, in which there is a mutual slaughter, which leaves the Tudors as effectively, and the Howards, as effectively the residuary legatees of the lot of them. Anyway, what are the values? England is a very, very strange mix. The central value is the typical value of chivalry, what he's shown wearing, the values of the knight, which is, in theory, the absolute loyalty to your immediate master, who would probably be a major nobleman, and then beyond that, to the king. They're the values of service, of loyalty, of submission, of courage, of honor. That whole repertory of values which modern feminism is determined to destroy. They are the archetypal masculine values, right? That is what the theory is. But England is not, and never was, or certainly not since Magna Carta, was not simply a state that was ruled, as the rubbish history says, by patriarchy. We developed very, very early an extremely elaborate constitutional structure, which derives principally from Magna Carta, from not particularly, in fact, not at all. Magna Carta is one of these things that I seem to spend the whole of my time saying we get history wrong, but we do. The Magna Carta of 1215 is a document of virtually no importance. The Magna Carta of 1215 is a radical, revolutionary, essentially republican document, which provided for rule by a council, the equivalent of a secret council of Venice, a council of 25 barons to whom the king would have been subject. It provided not for the centerpiece of a monarchical state is the oath of allegiance. Magna Carta of 1215 provided for an oath of allegiance to the charter, not to the king. It prescribed, in fact, that if the king refused to obey the charter, people were entitled to rebel against him. That everybody had to swear an oath not to the king, but to the charter and to the 25 barons. So it's a radical revolutionary document. It's transformed when it's reissued in 1217. John, thank God, safely dead, and his son, Henry III, on the throne by one of the most important, I think, one of the men who genuinely prefigures William Cecil, and he actually happens to be called William as well, William the Marshal, Earl of Pembroke. He is the first English statesman. And what William the Marshal does with the reissue of the Charter of 1217 is to turn it into a proto-constitution. He strikes out Chapter 61 with all of these radical quasi-republican conventions. And he not only does that, all the really difficult bits like, do we owe debts to the Jews? Do you know what they did? They set up a committee. And they carefully kicked all the difficult bits into touch, which leaves you with a nice, safe document that says nice things about justice and the freedom of the church and all the rest of it, that all good God-fearing Englishmen can agree on. And then with the final important reissue of the Charter in 1225, it becomes a genuine proto-constitution, because the reissue of 1225 is first of all done by Henry when he's a major, because in 1217, he's simply a boy, and the Charter is sealed by the seals of his two guardians, William the Marshal, the layman, and the papal legate, because, of course, John had surrendered England to the Pope as a papal fief by the papal legate Guala. But in 1225, the Charter is reissued by Henry VII, this time as a mature king over his own seal, but it's also, and this is the key thing, issued in return for a grant of taxation by everybody. It's the bargain between the king and his people. And the idea of Parliament stems from that. And what you get developing very, very quickly in the High Middle Ages is a representative assembly which is like no other in Europe. Remember, everywhere in Europe, there's nothing unique about the history of the English Parliament. The only peculiar thing about by the way, it is the English Parliament. The Scots Parliament was hopeless. Remember, Scotland is an infinitely minor, unimportant kingdom until union with England. It only matters when it goes into alliance with France and makes trouble. The Parliament of England is unlike any other in Western Europe, but it's not because it's the first, it's because it survives. It's the only parliament of a major state that survives. It's also very unusual in that it's not there simply to make trouble. The Supreme Court again got the history of Parliament completely wrong in its verdict on the prorogation. Parliament is not there to hold the government to account. It's there because it's useful. This is why it survives. Parliament is created and developed not by weak kings, but by strong kings. And even more uncomfortably for today's world, it is the great wars of the Middle Ages, particularly the wars of Edward I, and more especially the wars of Edward III, that lead to the development of Parliament as the agent of taxation. The English discover it's quite a good idea to ask people politely first before you take money from them, you know? And that's what Parliament is about. So what it does, it creates, and alongside that, the English kings, partly because of their inheritance from the Anglo-Saxons, have an unusually elaborate, structured pattern of high office holding. You've got this very formal machinery by which there is consent to law, by which there is consent to taxation. And finally, in the 12th century, and again uniquely in Western Europe, you get a development of native law, English common law, which acquires all the degrees of elaboration, of self-consciousness, of intellectual independence of Roman law. So you have a different type of law that develops in England with the whole apparatus of what we have now, of inns of court, of judges, of formal legal dress, of the coif. You didn't wear a wig, that's the 18th century. You wore a white coif, of the red robes and whatever. So you get this development of a highly structured pattern of administration, of Parliament, and finally, of nobility. There's something very peculiar, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, there's something very peculiar about the English nobility. If you look in France, for example, by the end of the 17th century, the reign of Louis XIV, you have a nobility. It's okay, it's a very big country as it is now. It's France at the end of the 17th century. It's 4 times the size of England and has between 4 and 5 times the population. France is already 25 million by the end of the 17th century. How many of them are noble? 250,000. The comparative size of the English nobility is 200. The English nobility is completely different. It is a parliamentary nobility. And under it, you've got the class of gentry, which in European parlance would have been the lesser nobility. But the gentry, as Cecil discovers, to his immense benefit, there is a single means by which you become a gentleman: having enough money and maintaining a certain style of life. As the contemporary, and indeed one of Cecil's teachers at Cambridge, writes in his De Republica Anglorum, you can maintain the port and state of a gentleman. Thomas Smith writes, gentlemen be made good cheap in England. You know, they're at a kind of bargain sale basement. All you need is enough money and the ability to maintain the port and state. This extraordinary kingdom is essentially, therefore, a military state. It functions only properly in war. The relationship between the king and the leading nobility is the king is war leader, and the nobles, using their knights and supporting barons and whatever, supply the troops. That's how it all works. That's how it's supposed to work. And of course, this state, when it's fighting and winning, does extraordinarily well. And there is clearly a very powerful sense of developing English identity, though remember, English only really is invented as a language quite late in this process. Do we all realize English is a very, very recent language? It only really emerges under Chaucer at the end of the 14th century as a recognizable literary language. And it's no accident that it's within 10 years of that that you get Henry V, again, the great conqueror king, consciously using English, whereas before official communication is in French and Latin, and indeed acts of parliament are in French until well into the 15th century. So England emerging as an idea in this extraordinary wave of medieval success. The war with France. I mean, Macron is absolutely right. England is the fundamental hostile power to France. That's what it is. The Channel is both an extraordinary means of communication, but it's also the widest strip of water in the world in terms of radically antithetical values on either side. England, an inductive culture, France, a deductive one. They're very, very strikingly different. Anyway, so what has happened to that culture? That culture collapses in the failure of the 100 Years' War. The ending of the 100 Years' War wrecks the late medieval English polity. And I really think, there was a great fashion when I was a young man to write off the Wars of the Roses. I think Shakespeare's account of them, as Shakespeare so often is, the detail may be wrong, the essence is right. It really is a moment of disintegration. Now, what's very interesting is we've got two ways of approaching this. The disintegration leads to some very serious reflection. In fact, probably the first serious text on the nature of the English polity, the nature of English politics. Again, one of the striking things about this culture is the extent to which it writes about itself, right? The extent to which it is, if you like, autobiographical, self-contemplatory. And the first serious account of how England works as a political culture is written at the height of the Wars of the Roses and is a product of both the fall of the House of Lancaster and the temporary rise of the House of York. And it's by a man called Sir John Fortescue, who was at the heart of this process, and it's called The Governance of England. And The Governance of England is a quite extraordinary text because what it's really saying is there is no such thing as the public interest. What it says is the king should live off his own. What that really means is he should live off his own resources. so that everybody else can live off their own resources too. And isn't England a wonderful country because it's got no values and no taxation? It sounds really like Margaret Thatcher on a bad day. You know, it is quite seriously, there is no such thing as society. We're in a church. There's an extraordinary episode in the governance of England in which you have a mock celebration, a mock religious celebration. The last time I did anything to do with the Cecil family was when I was speaking for Victoria over at Fotheringhay. Fotheringhay is one of the great collegiate churches which are erected as the burial place of the House of York. And these churches were heavily endowed, and the idea was that this endowment provided for the religious observance which would guarantee the family safe passage through purgatory. Okay, so you set up an endowment that would maintain a perpetual cycle of prayer. There's a parody, an actual parody of this in the governance of England, which says, if the King of England, Edward IV, in the final version of the thing, properly endows, as you did at Chantry, if he properly endows England with a permanent landed endowment so that he won't need to impose taxes, the entire country will become a choir offering up thanks to God, saying, God bless the king that there aren't any taxes. Right. Completely extraordinary notion of royal selfishness. That the purpose of the king's government is simply to benefit the king. And of course, that idea triumphs in the monarchy of Edward IV and Henry VII. That's what Henry VII is about. It's screwing as much money, and it's a bit like a bad local authority with parking fines. You pervert the courses of justice simply to make money, right? That's what Henry VII is about. That's what the whole business of Epsom and Dudley. You just screw the purposes of government for the private interest of the king. Now, that's that. Please have that idea in your head. But there's a very powerful counter-movement going on. And it begins in Italy. It begins in Italy, and it is the rediscovery of the political culture of the ancient world, particularly Cicero, and particularly the great texts of the Greeks, the Republic of Plato, and the Politics of Aristotle, and the De Republica of Cicero. These texts offer a completely different vision of a republican polity, in which there is a duty to the state, in which the purpose of education is to inculcate those values, in which the individual has that duty to serve a broader political interest. And what the Renaissance is about, we tend to think about the Renaissance as being like that tomb, all classical columns and curlicues, right? Its fundamental element is the communication of this new political culture. Originally, the only way you could get it was by going to Italy and studying. And I've been looking at some of the generation of young men who do that in the late 15th century, people like Thomas Langton, who is the shortest-serving Archbishop of Canterbury, possibly even less important in the history of the see than Archbishop Welby, which is very, very hard, apart from the fact he's probably the end of it. And Langton is a man who is in Italy for nearly 10 years, and you can see him absorbing this culture and returning to England and trying to apply it and serving Edward IV, and I think being disgusted with the king's selfishness. So what does he do? He becomes a passionate supporter of Richard III. And he is the man, the fact that he's a northerner too, like me, he's born a few miles from where I was, he's born in Appleby, I was born in Kendal, that helps a lot with Richard. But you get in the famous letter, which my view is every member of the Richard III Society is certifiable, but anyway, the letter that they always produce as a testimony to what a wonderful king the murderous Richard was, is written by my man, Thomas Langton, who refers refers to him in these terms of the new political culture. No king has done more good for the people. That the king's job is not to serve himself, it's to serve a broader interest. But who is Langton? Langton is a clergyman. It's clergy who absorbed this. The story of William Cecil is the story of 2 or 3 huge revolutionary transformations, because the culture of Italy comes to England. And it comes, of course, primarily because of printing, because of books. You can see Langton wandering the bookshops of Rome. He remembers usually to note where he bought a book. And you can actually see him wandering the book, and the books very happily survive, because the man who steps into his shoes at the bishopric of Winchester, which is the last long-term see that he holds, is the great servant of Henry VII, is Richard Fox, and his books pass into the Royal Library. And of course, he snaffles Langton's books because they're very important, so they too finish up in the Royal Library. But so this process of book buying, book acquisition, is central. It penetrates the universities, in particular the University of Cambridge. The great transformation, and it's Margaret Beaufort, and another figure that it was great fun to talk about, but we've got no time to do so, John Fisher. We all think of him as a martyr. He is in fact the most successful and ambitious academic politician of the early 16th century, and he is the man who gets Henry VII to throw unprecedented amounts of loot at the University of Cambridge. And the result is Cambridge at this point overtakes Oxford. This is why the 2 universities look completely different. Oxford is built out of stone and Cambridge is built out of Tudor red brick. They're radically, radically different. And so you get the development of the universities, and the great change is the one that is embedded in William Cecil's life. He is a layman and he goes to university. And he goes to the radical new foundation, which is the creation of Lady Margaret Beaufort and John Fisher, which is St. John's College, where he absorbs everything that Langton had had to go to Italy to absorb that 30 or 40 years earlier. And he absorbs it from the highest and the cleverest of people, like Cheek, like whose sister he marries, like Sir Thomas Smith, with sort of Ascham in the margins. And this, again, is a remarkable fact. This means he has exactly the same educational formation as his very near contemporary Queen Elizabeth I, because Elizabeth, as Henry VIII's daughter, although she's a woman, is given exactly this education by people who also come from come from St. John's College, Cambridge. So he is absorbing this new notion of the idea of the state and the Commonwealth. Now, how does this new notion fit itself with the real structures in England? Well, look at his tomb, look at Burghley. And the thing that strikes you is that they're both a fusion. They are the 2 things joined together. The most peculiar thing about Burghley, isn't it? You get this house with all these wonderful sort of classical columns and chimney pots, and what's in the middle of it? A huge church spire. Completely bizarre structure. Look at this thing here. Again, the knight surrounded by all this classical pomp. Look in the next century at the tomb of his descendant, and you will see that the Earl, as he by then is the Earl of Exeter, appears more or less naked in classical drapery that fits in. Here, he's the medieval knight wearing armour, wearing the garter, the greatest order of chivalry, with the wand of medieval office, surrounded by classical pomp. It's a fusion of these 2 cultures. And it's the balance of these 2 things. Now, again, in England, it works out in very interesting and very striking ways. Because, as I described to you, medieval England had this unusually elaborate and formalized structure of government, administration, of law, of a representative assembly. So what are the English able to do? Well, they're able to look at something like Cicero's De Republica, which is all about the relationship of the Senate and the leading members of the Roman aristocracy and the various patterns of office holders, of consuls and all the rest of it. And they're able to say, well, this is exactly what we have. Okay, we've got a king, but we can sort of deal with that. And the Romans, by the way, acquire an emperor. So what you do is you rework the ideas of the English constitution in terms of the Roman, essentially the Roman ideas of the republican state. And you produce a remarkable marriage of republican and monarchical ideas. But of course, that's not the only new thing. And there is a very famous essay written on Elizabethan England, which is called The Royal Republic of Elizabethan England. In other words, the nobility and the administrators of England very quickly come to see themselves as the equivalent of Roman senators, participating in that power of senatus populusque Romae, that double face of the thing. But then there's another great element of novelty. And that great element of novelty is, of course, religion. The new transformation of religion that happens because of the Reformation. And what is very striking here, again, is that Cecil is not only cutting edge in terms of his literary scholarship, he's a very fine Latinist and Greek, he doesn't take a degree, but very fine linguist, and a lot of modern Europe, like Queen Elizabeth I, though not, I think, quite as good. There's a wonderful school report on Elizabeth I by Richard Asham, which is absolutely classic. I'm sure those of you who've had kids at Stanford schools will be used to one of these snotty things in which though nowadays school teachers just have to hymn praise the whole of the time. In my day, you got the sneer of the lip. Anyway, Asham's report on Elizabeth is wonderful, that her spoken and written Latin, ancient Greek, English, let me get this right. Her spoken and written Latin, French, English, Spanish, and Italian were excellent. However, her spoken ancient Greek was only moderately good. Well, Cecil isn't quite as good as that, but there are three modern languages as well. So he's got this cutting-edge scholarship, but he's also cutting-edge in religion. He's a radical Protestant, all that business of awaiting the second coming of Christ. Once again, we have the equivalent, but very, very different texts in which the English analyse themselves. See, this is where Thomas More's Utopia comes in. Thomas More, looking at the values of the Republic and looks at the values of England and Christianity. And what answer does he come up with in Utopia? He comes up with the answer in Utopia, and you should read it alongside his History of Richard III, that England is a country of no moral worth or value whatever. Right? That in other words, that we are it's a society founded on selfishness, on the worship of gold, on the worship of honour, of things that are utterly un-Christian. He begins with the idea, very simple. The Commonwealth means you have things in common, which is why Utopia is a form of communism, right? So that's More's position. Not that he ever puts it into practice, but it's a very, very lively piece of writing. More interesting is the work of my own ancestor, collateral ancestor, Thomas Starkey, who also gets into bad trouble because he speaks too freely. It must run in the family. And Thomas writes a remarkable text, which is in the form of a dialogue between Poole, that's the man who's going to become Cardinal Poole, and a very brilliant young man called Thomas Lupset. And it's set actually in a setting very much like Burley. It's set in the grounds of an English country house. And it's a dialogue on what moral values can you find in England. And very interestingly, this is extraordinary. Here is Starkey, most brilliant, probably the most brilliant linguist of his day, of the early 1530s, has spent all his time in Venice, educated in Padua and whatever. He writes about England through the aristocracy. He sees in the traditions of the medieval English aristocracy those offices that you see represented by Cecil holding that wand. The Lord Treasurer, the Lord Chancellor, the Lord Great Chamberlain, the Lord Steward. He sees these as offering a chance of limited responsible government. And he goes back to some of the high texts of the Middle Ages that were the work of rebels against the very powerful monarchies of Edward I and Edward III and Richard II to come up with these ideas. In other words, he for the first time sees moral value in the medieval English inheritance. And from that point onwards, this becomes the accepted tradition, but it shifts away from a narrow focus on the aristocracy into a much broader focus, particularly in the hands of a man who had been actually a mentor to Cecil and was his predecessor as Royal Secretary, Sir Thomas Smith, in his De Republica Anglorum of the English Commonwealth, in which he moralizes the existing constitution of the monarchy, parliament, English law, the jury system, the counties, the lot. They're invested with the same kind of rigor as the Romans invested their entirely rigorous constitutional setup. You simply transfer it to England, which is another reason, of course, why he is wearing a toga. If you look in the 18th century squares of London and you see the great aristocrats, you see the Russells and you see the Cavendish Bentincks and whatever, they're all looking like Roman senators. That's what they see themselves as. The famous portrait of the death of William Pitt the Elder as he actually dies, he's taken with a seizure in the House of Lords, in those days you actually wore your parliament robes, but he's wearing his parliament robes like a toga. They're flung off like this. They're identifying themselves with that world. Now, where did religion come in? You see, I think this is both the great secret and the disaster. Was really that sense of serving the broader public interest, was it really viable in the world of the 16th century? Is it viable now, when it's confronted with self-interest, power, the ability to put your hand in the till, which, as I've said, I'm afraid Burley does not resist, and on a huge, huge scale. There's also spectacular maladministration of the royal finances. Burley is constantly congratulated in building up a huge cash reserve ahead of the Armada. There was a little problem. Every one of the responsible officers, bar two of the Exchequer, who were keeping that money, went bankrupt as the Armada sailed up the Channel. The reason is they'd lent it all out at long-term rates of interest in the city, and when there is a short-term crisis, you can't get it back again. Of that 300,000, Elizabeth loses 2. Isn't it difficult? Now, there were clear shifts in the direction of some sort of recognition of an overarching value. In my period, when you look, in other words, the reign of Henry VIII, when you look at a building the equivalent of Burley, but built 40 or 50 years earlier. If you look at somewhere like Compton Winyates, or if you look at Ightham Moat, you will see that they are covered with royal emblems. They're covered with the same emblems as appear in the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster. So you'll have roses and portcullises and falcons and all the rest of it, which are the badges of the 2 royal houses of Lancaster and York. They actually mean something. They mean that these people are actually sworn servants of the king. And England is really run by these people. Again, we've got to be honest. Tudor England is really a mafia. It's a mafia state. The sworn servants of the king, of Henry VII or Henry VIII, they're the equivalent of a mafia. Or the Communist Party. You've got this formal structure of government that I describe, but the thing that powers it is the personal following of the king. Now, this is undoubtedly broadened and deepened by the time of Elizabeth. One of the things that's striking about Burghley, along with most other Elizabethan houses, is the prominence of the royal arms, Elizabeth's arms. They're everywhere, particularly over fireplaces. And this becomes true of virtually every gentleman's house in England. There is a clear idea of the allegiance to the sovereign it's broader than just a sectional allegiance. It is to do with, as Cecil constantly says, the Queen and the state. There's that broader sense. So something is developing. But, oh dear, it's not enough to get Parliament to vote regular taxes. Cecil votes taxes, what are called the subsidy, which are in theory assessed on your income. Cecil's income, this is the man in charge of taxation, because he's the equivalent of not only the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he is the equivalent also of the head of the Inland Revenue, and it's a form of income tax. Cecil's income is at least £4,000 a year. What does he declare? £133. Sorry, this is embarrassing. Forgive me, I'm teasing. I'm slightly teasing, but it's really important to be honest about these things and to understand them. So what does drive Cecil? You see, I think this is both the triumph of the Tudor state and its failure. And Henry VIII begins repudiating his father, because correctly he sees that the selfish monarchy of Epsom and Dudley is a bad idea, and he demonstrates it with all the flair of Henry VIII by cutting their heads off. This is a very effective way of policy repudiation. And then but what does he do? He then just tries to revive the 100 Years' War against France. And England can't do it. The combination of circumstances of the 14th and 15th centuries, with a France divided and a French royal house split, doesn't apply in the early 16th century, and England can do little more than dent on the margins. Henry VIII only acquires a purpose accidentally. In the same way, Boris is created by Brexit and creates Brexit. Henry VIII is created by the accident of the Reformation, the creation of a new confessional state. And the purpose of the state becomes to enforce religious conformity. And that's exactly what Cecil does, which is why there are all the references to awaiting the second coming of Christ and whatever. So it becomes a new kind of confessional state. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, this is also profoundly divisive, because people don't agree on religion. Cecil's own life shows this violent alteration from being a leading member of the circle of Edward VI. I mean, he's Secretary of State in whatever he is, in his 20s. This astonishingly rapid promotion, and then, of course, absolute retreat once Mary becomes queen and Catholicism comes back. And again, one has to say, Cecil, like his mistress Elizabeth, doesn't stick his neck out under Mary. He clearly conforms, as Elizabeth did, and makes much less noise about doing it than Elizabeth did. And then, of course, with the restoration of Protestantism under Elizabeth, he comes back as a great force. The problem is, and this is the real problem, I think Cecil is right. I think Elizabeth is right. I think Henry are right. The confessional state confers wholly new power and force on the monarchy. But the trouble is, it turns into a two-edged sword, because people feel about religion too strongly. And it's not only Catholics who oppose. Different types of Protestant fight with each other. And what I think you can see is that the England of Elizabeth and I gather Susan last time was talking somewhat about this. The England of Elizabeth faces not only the immense challenges of being a very post-Brexit pariah state in Europe, with the threat of France and Germany and the Empire joining against you. Isn't it modern? Isn't it exactly what we may be seeing over the Northern Irish Protocol? You not only face that, you face profound division at home. You face a war on two fronts between possible Catholic treason and acute division within Protestantism. And it seems to me that for all the triumphs of Cecil and Elizabeth, the success of the Armada, Elizabeth's astonishing, absolute defying of gravity of remaining an unmarried queen for that period of time, of seeing off the threat from Mary, Queen of Scots, simply by outliving her and by the expedient, of course, of cutting her head off, which again Cecil is directly instrumental in. Cecil cheats Elizabeth. Cecil actually effectively doesn't forge the papers. He gets the Queen's signatories obtained by Secretary Davidson, but with strict instructions that it's not to be used. And what Cecil does, he uses Davidson as a stool pigeon. The document is removed without Elizabeth being aware of it and sent straight off to Fotheringhay, and her head is cut off. But all of these divisions are there, and this is what happens in the next century under Cecil's son. This state which is semi-formed, this notion of a public interest which is sort of there but not quite, these radical divisions about religion, with Catholic on the one hand and Protestant on the other, further exacerbated with all the tensions of semi-union with Scotland. I mean, the 17th century, the union of crowns under James I, is utterly catastrophic. The relationship of the two crowns with separate parliaments and separate governments, but a single king, are at their very worst. They're worse than at any time in the Middle Ages. So all these pigeons come home to roost. And you have the repeated civil wars of the 17th century, the seeds of which are sown now. And the thing is only knit up in the extraordinary shifts of the Glorious Revolution and the accession of Walpole to power in 1720. And what happens is you get a genuine agreement on religion with very, very few marginal things. And it's unique also, whereas the general rule had been. Remember, again, following Henry VIII, every monarch changes religion. Apart from James I, every monarch changes religion until there's a wonderful rule which is developed by the English, who are very slow in these matters, but when they do it, they're quite thorough, as again with Brexit. Up to that point, there is the doctrine that the religion of the king is the religion of the people. And the English have this revolutionary idea, wouldn't it be much easier if the religion of the king was the religion of the people? In other words, the popular religion of the people will determine what is the religion of the king, rather than the religion of the king determining what is the religion of the people. That's one thing. And the second thing is that the triumphant solution to the problems of the relationship of public-private, levels of taxation and everything else, is when it's harnessing the wicked powers of corruption. This is what, I'm afraid, Robert Walpole is all about. The foundation of the office of Prime Minister is you use the wealth of the monarchy, the office holding that's available to it, to bribe the governing class into being acquiescent in Parliament. And that's how you actually create a new, supremely powerful state structure, which is why France is defeated, why you have Marlborough, why you have the triumphs of the 7 Years' War, and I suppose the final vindication of the sort of royal republic which Cecil had glimpsed as a young man and tried to put in practice as a councillor. Thank you. And I shall be delighted to take questions, and there should be many. come on. I'm quite sweet, really. Yes, please, could you stand up? Yeah. So can you speak more slowly? The acoustic is terrible. Why don't you come up here and talk into the microphone? That's going to be, everybody will then hear, including me. Please.
Thank you. I was thinking of these other times, if Cecil had been alive in other reigns, maybe of a king, would he have been accused of being this alter X? He did a lot of things to, like behind Elizabeth's back, scribbling out parts of her letters and doing things behind her back, like writing the press release for her meeting with Mary Queen of Scots a couple of weeks before it was officially cancelled, and also many things about sort of pushing Mary into plotting against Elizabeth. Would he have been able to do any of this, or is it such a special relationship with Elizabeth that allowed him to sort of take advantage of it in a way to push his Protestant agenda?
Very interesting. It's quite clear, actually, that any seriously competent royal councillor had an agenda. I mean, it's quite clear, for example, that Thomas Cromwell under Henry VIII is pursuing close relations with the Schmalkaldic League and the Lutherans when Henry doesn't want it. And Henry, but of course, knows what to do. Henry goes off on a retreat with Cromwell's, I suppose, enemy, but certainly absolute polar opposite in terms of religious affiliation, the wonderfully named Cuthbert Tunstall, Bishop of Durham, and actually negotiates with the Lutherans and studies the negotiations with the Lutherans deliberately several miles away from Cromwell. So I think the peculiarity with Elizabeth is, to a significant extent, that she is a woman. That this creates a very different pattern of relationships in politics. If you look why Henry VIII is able to keep, although much lazier than his daughter, is able to keep as much control over politics as he does, you've got two centres of politics. You've got the formal structures of the council. This is, it's William Cecil, Privy Councillor to the Most Serene Elizabeth. The council is where Cecil is the triumphant figure, as both secretary and, as if you like, dominant minister. But under Henry VIII, you also have the inner court, the thing that I spent my time studying when I was a graduate student, the Privy Chamber, which is the equivalent of the Downing Street staff. These people, the Cummingses, the Mandelsonses of this world, these shadowy figures, the chiefs of staff, the lubricators, the handlers of private finance, the intriguers. These are the ones who keep the monarch, literally, or the prime minister. We are really ruled not by the cabinet. The cabinet is a cipher at the moment. We're essentially ruled by the inner circle, the equivalent of the Privy Chamber. Elizabeth couldn't do that because they're women. She is the only woman, as queen, who could exercise direct royal power. There is no evidence that any of her women are anything more than instruments in the hands of Cecil or of the hands of Dudley. The collection of essays that I edited on the English court way back in the 1980s, the essay by Pam Wright, which has never been corrected on this point, makes it absolutely clear that that's the case. And again, under Henry, you could have a very different pattern even in this area, because, of course, you have figures that I call Canny Boleyn. You've got powerful wives of ideological position who, of course, exercise a different kind of power. You've no equivalent under Elizabeth. So, yes, there is a peculiarity. And again, you can see very clearly when James comes to the throne that there's a dramatic shift of political texture, because you go back again to this double-centred structure of politics between the council and the bedchamber. as it then is. And of course, even more dramatic under James, in that all but one member of the bedchamber is Scots, and all but one member of the Privy Council is English. So you can imagine what the state of relations between those were. Well, actually, it was quite easy. You simply devoted most of the resources of government to bribing the Scots of the bedchamber. That's how it worked. True, absolutely true. Yes. Follow up? Gosh, you are acquiescent. Yes. Any other ideas? Yes, Miranda. Did we all hear? The question was, how in control was Cecil of his own public image? I think to a very considerable extent, there's a very powerful machinery of censorship. But equally, of course, there is licensed dissent, and everybody knew, I think, that it was Cecil who was being laughed at as Polonius in Hamlet. That it's and this is stuff of very, very wide circulation. And again, all political figures in Elizabeth's reign of one sort, or all the leading political figures, are subject to very, very hostile. It is not an absolutism. I mean, it's a society in which certainly forms of active disloyalty against the Queen are published savagely, and criminal prosecutions are brought in certain other cases. But there's a very, very wide licensing of dissent, which is frequently public. It can operate in printing, it can operate very definitely in Parliament, it operates in the Council, it operates in the Court, it operates in the City. This is a high. You look at Shakespeare's plays; they suggest a highly complex political society. The one that's the best portrait, actually, of the world of Elizabeth is Troilus and Cressida, although it's set in an imaginary classical world. The whole patterns of behaviour of the Greek generals, Ulysses as the archetypal politician, the two rival forms of Ajax and Achilles, the two rival forms of knighthood, Thersites as the alienated intellectual. They're very, very typical Tudor court figures. So I don't think, not even Elizabeth herself. Remember famously, and look at how rude he was. Her ex-favourite, falling favourite, the Earl of Essex, and Elizabeth is deeply sensitive of the fact. He stages a performance of Richard II, the play about deposition. Elizabeth, I am Richard II, know ye not that? And the famous line, her conditions were as ill as her carcass. That's on the Virgin Queen, He did lose his head, but Yep, sir.
Excuse me for posing a what-if question.
Please do, yeah.
What might have happened if there hadn't been William Cecil?
What might have happened if there hadn't been William Cecil? Well, it's a period where there is a lot of talent. There is a lot of talent. Elizabeth clearly and rightly values him enormously. And there is a bond of trust between them which is unique and unbreakable. On the other hand, somebody who, for various reasons, is thrust aside, but maybe if Cecil hadn't come along, would have had to have been brought back to power, somebody like William Paget, is at least as able as Cecil. And a much better sense of humour. There are a surprising number of them. Figures that have become sort of standard hate figures, like Stephen Gardiner, are astonishingly intelligent. You see, I think it's one of these ages of and again, it's one of the reasons why we're fascinated with it. It's no accident, in one sense, it's no accident you've got a Shakespeare. This is the moment at which English has another period of collision. English is a product of collision. The emergence of English at the end of the 15th century, at the end of the 14th century rather, it's a collision between the native grunt. I mean, Anglo-Saxon had turned into grunts. It had turned from a highly inflected language of complex grammar, which is when it's a written language in Anglo-Saxon England, into a peasant patois, which loses its declensions, it loses all its grammatical structure. But then there's this collision with French, and the two are melded together by Chaucer. Well, there's another collision in the 16th century, which is the collision with Latin, and particularly Greek. If you look at, and we were talking about More gives up trying to translate his own Richard III into English, because he couldn't. English lacked abstract nouns. There's a remarkable section in his Richard III. By the way, there's a very strong resemblance between Thomas More's Richard III and Boris Johnson. They're joker figures. They're deadly joker figures. And there is this wonderful passage in the original, in the Latin, which is which effectively says, Richard, this is Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is a chameleon. He is an actor who can play many roles. He can laugh with the merry and weep with the sad, jolly them along. More couldn't translate that into English. There's no word for role. No? And what you get is this invention. This is what Shakespeare... There's a wonderful story, isn't there, told of Hamlet. An old lady heard it for the first time, and she was asked what she thought of it, and she said she thought it was very impressive, but she was surprised that Shakespeare had used so many quotations. And Shakespeare is the one who invents language. This is language, words being invented for new ideas. And you can see this extraordinary fusion of language. The line I always use when I'm trying to explain this is Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, the washing the hands and whatever. And it's this wonderful pair of lines. The blood is on my hands, will the seas wash it out? No, this blood will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Latin, multitudinous incarnadine. Anglo-Saxon, green one red. And it's this cultural clash which then produces something wonderful in every way. And again, all of these people were talking about, one way or another, Thomas Cromwell getting all of this stuff as a jobbing soldier and merchant, wandering around Europe, reading books, teaching himself Italian, reading Castiglione. This is this explosion of a culture clash, which leads to a culture fusion, which has the same energy as a kind of nuclear fusion. And this is the world that we're looking at with these people. But of course, it's still exploding in the reign of Elizabeth. So I said, I think you have this long crisis in English politics between the England, which is the dominant European state of the 14th and early 15th century, to England, which is the dominant European state of the late 17th, 18th, 19th, early 20th century. And this period of what is really a prolonged religious war, primarily religious war, in the middle. Shall we pause there? And thank you all very much.
Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.